Hello, everyone, and welcome to another terrific webinar presented to you in collaboration between the International Council of Psychologists and the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights. We have an excellent presentation today. We want you to know that we have participants on this webinar from all over the world, and we welcome your questions, your comments throughout. I'd like to now just move into the presentation and introduce our moderator for today's presentation, and that is Marlena Plavčić from Juraj Dobrila University of Pula in Croatia. Marlena, would you please join us and introduce our speakers for today?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Andy. I would like to use this opportunity to wish all of you a happy International Women's Day, especially to girls and women who are in those parts of the world where there is war, where there is conflict, and for those of you who are in the flight because of that. Let me now introduce our two speakers. Today we have Sean Megan Byrne and Silvia Sara Caneto, who are both psychologists and professors. First, Sean will be the one to present her work. So Sean Megan Byrne is Professor Emerita of Psychology at California Polytechnic State University in the United States of America. She's author of 4 books and many research articles. Her interdisciplinary book with the title Women Across Cultures, A Global Perspective, will next year have its 5th edition with the McGraw-Hill. So congratulations on that, Sean. This book applies intersectional and human rights perspectives to gender inequality and women's and girls' empowerment. Our next speaker, Sean's colleague, is Silvia Sara Caneto. She is from Italy. She studied at the Università di Padova. Now she's professor of psychology at the Colorado State University in the United States of America. Her graduate degrees are from Italy, as I already mentioned, from Israel, and from the United States of America. Her scholarship is on women's human rights, gender and suicidal behavior, and gender science and engineering. Silvia received 2 distinguished awards for her work. One is from the International Council of Psychologists Denmark Grunwald Award, and the other one is from the Society for the Psychology of Women's Heritage. So let's welcome Sean Megan Byrne's presentation.
Greetings on this International Women's Day, celebrated since 1901. It was originally intended to highlight the struggles of working class women and to promote women's right to vote. The idea is that on this day, every year, we come together to speak in one voice to promote women's economic, political, and reproductive rights. International Women's Day is also a day to celebrate women's activism and resilience, and to express gratitude to all that work on behalf of gender equality. I'm Sean Byrne from the California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, California. I'm a feminist psychologist and author of Women Across Cultures, A Global Perspective, where I explore women's issues and empowerment through a feminist, intersectional, and human rights lenses. Today, I'm talking about the interface between feminist psychology and the women's human rights endeavor. And it's always good to start with the basics, and what's more basic than a few definitions? First, let's think about what we mean by gender inequality. We can say that gender inequality is the disadvantage of girls and women relative to boys and men. These gender disadvantages are embedded in our socio-cultural, economic, political, and legal systems, what is sometimes called patriarchy. For example, globally, women earn on average 77% of what men earn. Jobs held predominantly by women are typically lower in status and pay. The importance of women's unpaid domestic and care labor is overlooked and undervalued. Women comprise only 25.5% of the world's lawmakers, and that's an all-time high. Globally, only 22% of CEOs are women, and women comprise less than a third of corporate board members. Some forms of violence are gendered and are experienced disproportionately by women and girls. This violence against women and girls, as we call it, or VAWG, includes female genital mutilation, forced marriage, sex trafficking, sexual assault, including rape and sexual harassment, intimate partner violence, and also gender-related killings such as dowry murder, honor killing, rape, murder, and sex-selective abortion. According to the World Health Organization, 35% of women have experienced physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner or sexual violence by a non-partner. Women and girls as objects and property are another example of gender inequality. When people are viewed as objects, commodities, or property, they are diminished and dehumanized. And in many ways and in many places, girls and women are treated as objects to be ogled, traded, sold, and controlled. There are many different examples of women and girls as objects and property. One common form of women's objectification is sexual objectification, the reduction of women and girls to bodies existing for men's pleasure. The sexual objectification of women and girls is evident in media. It's also experienced daily by many women and girls in the form of street harassment, and also the objectifying gaze, the visual inspection of a woman's body by another person, including leering or looking at a woman up and down. Street harassment and objectifying gaze are common experiences for women worldwide. Sexual exploitation is also, unfortunately, quite common. This includes sexual abuse for other sexual gratification or financial gain, as in the case of prostitution and pornography and in sex trafficking. Most gender inequalities can be framed as violations of these basic human rights. Intimate partner violence often violates multiple human rights, including the right to equality, Article 1, the right to life, liberty, and security of person, Article 3, that no one should ever be tortured or held in slavery, Articles 4 and 5, and that everyone has the right to freedom of movement, Article 13. The psychology of women is a subdiscipline of psychology and uses feminist scholarship and practice to advocate for gender equality and social justice, and also to improve the lives of diverse girls and women. Feminist research is conducted on an array of topics, including gender stereotypes, gender roles, gender socialization, gender identity, women's trauma treatment and recovery, and specific women's issues such as sexual violence. Next, let's think about where women's human rights and feminist psychology meet. This is the interface of the women's human rights endeavor and feminist psychology. First, note the overlapping goals of the women's human rights endeavor and the psychology of women. This is part of the interface of WHR and feminist psychology. Both endeavors are concerned with girls' and women's issues such as sexual violence, women's labor, and women's health and sexuality. A key focus of both is empowerment. Empowerment is about helping girls and women advocate for their rights and have decision-making power in their public and private lives. The overarching goal of both endeavors is to promote gender equality and to improve the lives of girls and women. And that includes advocacy for sociocultural changes that are needed for gender equality to occur. For example, WHR advocates use human rights instruments to promote women's rights. They ensure women's issues and rights are included in international agreements and in UN agencies and intergovernmental agreements and policymaking. They create global networks to support specific equality struggles. They partner with labor, environmental, and human rights organizations. They form coalitions to influence policy. They share strategies and information to support local gender equality efforts. Globally, women's advocates and activists use international human rights agreements to promote gender equality and social justice and to redress problems arising from gender injustice. Activists use human rights agreements to hold their governments accountable and to pressure them to adopt, enforce, and implement consistent policies, programs, and laws. Educating women about their human rights also motivates and empowers grassroots challenges to gender inequalities. As WHR scholars Bunch and Frost said in 2000, whether used in political lobbying, in legal cases, in grassroots mobilization, or in broad-based educational efforts, women's human rights are a rallying point for women and serve the creation of strategies for the promotion and protection of girls' and women's equality. Meanwhile, feminist psychologists support gender equality through research that documents gender inequalities, its causes, its effects, its treatment. And this information is used by governments, grassroots organizations, lawyers, etc., to advocate for individual women, groups of women, and for legal and social change. For example, I recently wrote a paper reviewing theory and research on sexual harassment, what it is, different types and manifestations, who's more likely to be targeted, how targets of sexual harassment are affected, why and when it occurs, who are the harassers, and what all of this suggests about how to stop it. And at least once a month, someone reaches out to me who's using this work or wants to use this work to advocate for sexual harassment survivors or for legal and policy changes. A colleague of mine, a feminist organizational psychologist, recently testified in a legal case where a law mandated an equal percentage of women and men on corporate boards. She shared the research on gender in corporate boards, research that lands clearly on the side of legal remedies to this common glass ceiling. Another shared goal is empowerment. Empowerment is about providing information, education, training, and support so women can be the architects of their own lives. They can transition from victims to resilient survivors. They can assert their legal and human rights so they are free and equal. We empower women when we provide programs and services that meet educational, economic, health, and safety needs, or the information to access such programs and services. For example, services that help people safely leave abusive relationships, programs to foster financial or political literacy, reproductive health services so women can control the number and spacing of their children. We empower women when we provide education about their legal and human rights and how to assert them, when we provide mental and physical health, trauma, and recovery services and support so women can reclaim their lives, when we provide research-based information on gender inequalities. Believe me, it's empowering to have a name for what's happening or has happened to you. It's empowering to know the facts on how it affects women and girls. This helps us to call it out, reject it, to stand up to it. As an example, think about how clearer definitions of sexual harassment and discussion about how this affects women's daily lives and livelihoods has empowered women in their daily lives and has empowered their activism for change. The feminist psychology WHR interface also includes some shared ideology, particularly a belief that gendered power relations are socially constructed, and a belief in the importance of respect for diversity and considering intersectionality. First, let me say a little bit about the idea that gender and gender inequality are socially constructed. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, and attributes that a society or culture deems appropriate for girls, women, or boys and men. And societies and cultures have gender roles that tell us what jobs are expected and considered natural for us based on our gender. So, for example, in every society, women do most of the daily routine household labor are the primary caregivers of children and elders, regardless of their paid employment. This is seen as natural for them due to gender stereotypes suggesting that females are naturally nurturing and other-centered. Gender stereotypes they represent beliefs about how the genders are naturally and fundamentally different. And cultures and societies have these gender stereotypes that they use to justify gender inequalities. So, for example, psychological research demonstrates that men aren't better leaders and managers than women. However, gender stereotypes remain a barrier to qualified women advancing into leadership positions. Leadership qualities are often viewed as masculine qualities that are more likely to be possessed by men than women. Gender stereotypes also keep girls and women out of science, technology, engineering, math education, and out of STEM careers. And that's because in many societies, math and science are stereotyped as the domain of boys and men. Cultures and societies also have gender norms that tell us what we're supposed to do based on our gender, how we're supposed to dress, look, act, who we're supposed to love. And conformity is ensured by granting social status and approval to conformers and by rejecting and pressuring and punishing violators. Gender socialization is the process by which we learn what's expected of us based on gender. We learn these gender stereotypes, gender norms, gender roles from our family, peers, myths, literature, media, religion, and so on. And likewise, gender inequality is a social construction embedded in family, cultural, economic, legal, and political social structures and practices. And that's why gender equality requires transforming these human-created systems, beliefs, and practices. For example, rape is disproportionately experienced by girls and women, and the threat of rape limits women's and girls' freedom of movement. Trauma from rape has serious psychological and physical costs. This interferes with our pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. It limits our ability to fully participate in society. Rape is an expression of dominance and power and contempt. It's a rejection of women's right to self-determination. And the threat of rape also makes women dependent on fathers, brothers, and husbands to protect them. From a social constructivist perspective, addressing this is about dismantling rape cultures. And rape cultures accept sexual assault. They, to some extent, promote it, ignore it, or minimize it. In a gender-equal world, laws, media, and traditions that normalize and excuse men's sexual violence against women would be changed. Men would be taught how not to rape instead of teaching women how not to get raped. Rape would not be something to joke about, and it wouldn't be romanticized or sexualized in the media. Masculinities that sexually objectify women and condone non-consensual sexual contact with women and girls would be transformed. Victims would be believed and supported, not blamed and tarnished, and rapists would be held accountable by law enforcement and justice systems. Feminist psychology and the WHR endeavor also share a multicultural, intersectional, contextualized approach. Over time, and partly due to criticism, both feminist psychology and women's human rights endeavors have become more inclusive, intersectional, and reflective of women's diversity. Women and girls share certain experiences due to their gender, but their experiences as women and girls vary widely depending on their race, social class, ethnicity, nationality, region, disability, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, and their religion, and also whether they're refugees, immigrants, and so on. The interplay of these different categories is what we mean by intersectionality. Gender is intersectional because the way it's enacted and experienced depends on the way that it interacts with other social categories and identities. And so to fully understand women and girls issues and to empower them, we need to consider intersectionality and also the economic, cultural, social, historical, and political context in which they are situated. And that's what we mean by contextualizing. Now, likewise, gender inequality is influenced by intersectionality. Trans women, for example, face unique discriminations in employment and housing. They experience high rates of sexual violence because of their gender identity. Women of color often experience racialized forms of sexual harassment. In many places, non-heterosexual women and gender non-conforming women are expelled from their homes, disowned by their families, not allowed to have children, prosecuted by the state, and forced to marry men and undergo so-called therapy to change their sexual orientation. As the poet Audre Lorde once said, "I am a Black feminist. I recognize that my power, as well as my primary oppressions, came as a result of my Blackness as well as my womanness, and therefore my struggles on both fronts are inseparable." I want to end by saying a little bit about how the feminist psychology and women's human rights endeavors can benefit each other. So first, what can feminist psychology do for the women's human rights endeavor? And first, psychologists can share tools to promote women's empowerment and recovery from gender-based trauma. And second, they can provide research-based support to women's human rights advocates who must document and prove women's human rights violations. So, for example, feminist psychology research can support the WHR mission with evidence demonstrating the scope and psychological costs of gendered human rights violations. Likewise, the women's human rights approach can strengthen and enrich feminist psychology in practice. Grounding the psychology of women in human rights provides additional tools to promote women's and girls' empowerment. Psychologists should familiarize themselves with intersectional, culturally sensitive counseling approaches that empower their clients to bring change in their own lives, families, and communities in ways that work for them and respect their right to those aspects of their culture that enrich their lives. Psychologists should familiarize themselves with the UNDHR and human rights agreements specific to women's human rights. CEDAW, for example, states that ratifying nations have the responsibility to, quote, modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customs and all other practices which are based on the idea of the inferiority or superiority of either of the sexes or on stereotyped roles for men and women. That's from Article 5 of CEDAW. So we can respect cultural diversity and we can promote women's human rights, and we can do both of these when we advocate for women's full participation in their cultures and when we recognize the role of intersectionality in women's experience of gender inequality. We do this when we provide culturally sensitive therapies and interventions to foster women's empowerment such that they can be the architects of culturally sensitive change in their own lives and communities.
Thank you, Sean, for your presentation, for the introduction, and for defining the concepts that are relevant for what we have today. Sean and Sylvia wrote a beautiful article, and I'm sure Sylvia will tell you something about this. Now, Sylvia will address the cultural issues facing the women's rights. Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Plavšik and Dr. Simon, for the introductions. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Sylvia, everything is perfect.
Okay. So, and thank you also to Dr. Bullock and Dr. Plavšik for inviting Dr. Byrne and me to present on women and human rights in this webinar series on psychology and human rights for the Global Network of Psychologists and Human Rights. Dr. Byrne and I are the co-authors of a chapter on women and human rights for the Cambridge Handbook of Psychology and Human Rights, edited by Flores and Rubin. Our presentations draw from that chapter as well as work that we published individually and with other colleagues. The common theme across our presentation and the common titles of our two talks today is women and human rights, concepts, debates, and implications for psychology and for psychologists. A variety of international human rights agreements, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, have established the universality of individual human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the foundational international document on human rights. The rights recognized as fundamental in the Declaration include civil and political rights, like the rights to security of person, participation in public life, protection under the law, and freedom of movement, opinion, expression, and assembly, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. The rights to education, work, equal pay for equal work, rest and leisure, property, and participation in cultural life. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights stipulates that these human rights apply to all equally without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, or other status. Women were critical in ensuring that women were explicitly included in the Declaration and in its protections. They made sure that the language of the Declaration was inclusive, for example, using words like human being instead of men, or that it explicitly named women. Hansa Mehta of India, on the right side of this picture, is credited for changing the phrase, all men are born free and equal, to all human beings are born free and equal. She was one of two, with Eleanor Roosevelt, female delegates to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in 1947-48. Dominican Republic's Minerva Bernardino, next to Mehta in this picture, argued for inclusion in the preamble of the words, the equality of men and women. Together with other Latin American women, Berta Luz of Brazil and Isabel de Vidal of Uruguay, she played a crucial role in advocating for the inclusion of women's rights and non-discrimination based on sex in the United Nations Charter, which in 1945 became the first international agreement to recognize the equal rights of women and men. A variety of international human rights agreements have also recognized the right to culture. For example, Article 5 of the 2001 Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity by UNESCO states that cultural rights are an integral part of human rights and that all persons have the right to participate in the cultural life of their choice and conduct their own cultural practices. Other international human rights instruments that address the right to culture include the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, the International Bill of Rights, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice, the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief, the Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National, Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities, and the Declaration on the Rights to Development, as well as the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all migrant workers and members of their families. These international declaration and convention articulate a broad range of cultural rights. For example, the right to cultural participation, the right to enjoy the arts, conservation and development and diffusion of culture, protection of cultural heritage, freedom for creative activity, protections of persons belonging to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, freedom of assembly and association, the right to education, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, and the principle of non-discrimination. The dominant position in human rights declaration, resolution, and protocols is that the right to culture is bounded by respect and protection for the human rights of the individual. For example, Article 4 of the 2001 UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity states that no one may invoke cultural diversity to infringe upon human rights guaranteed by international law, nor to limit their scope. Similarly, Article 5 affirms that the right to cultural practices is subject to respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Still, Some have claimed that in the case of women, the right to culture takes precedence over the rights of the individual. In other words, the equality of women and men in human rights is viewed by some people as uniquely inconsistent with the right to culture and as uniquely deserving of lesser priority. People who take this perspective have argued that the idea of women's and men's equality in rights represent a, quote, a Western mode of thinking and even a tool of imperialism. A recommendation based on this perspective is that the human rights of women be subject to cultural interpretation and reframing. This presentation, I examine and challenge the idea that women's human rights and the right of culture are in unique opposition, and the idea that women's human rights should be relativized based on culture. There are many arguments and different kinds of evidence one can consider to challenge these two ideas. In this presentation, I will examine three main arguments. The first argument is that the idea of an opposition between women's human rights and the right to culture is grounded on the false premise that cultures are homogeneous, static, and bounded. In fact, cultures are not homogeneous. Different and even contradictory ideas, values, and practices are present in all cultures. By the way, this is also true of religion, which is a form of culture. For instance, some argue that women's subordination to men is prescribed by religious texts. At the end, it would be sacrilegious if initiated by that religion's followers, and a disrespectful imposition against the right to culture if done by outsiders. As noted by Arat, this argument ignores that all religious texts are received in a cultural context and, quote, fused with the prevailing cultural norms. Also, all religious texts contain a diversity of messages, including a diversity of messages about women and men. Which of these messages prevails depends on interpretation, and most importantly, on who holds interpretative privilege. Men are the majority among those who hold interpretative privilege in the dominant religions of the world. Cultures are also not static nor bounded. Cultural values and practices are constantly evolving. For example, some men and women in a culture may view status and power inequalities by sex as natural, unchangeable, and even healthy, and may fight to maintain the power differences. Other women and men in the same culture may believe the status and power inequalities by sex to be socially constructed and hurtful, and may fight to change them. Also, cultures constantly mix and change in response to each other's influence. As a result of these interactions, cultures stay dynamic and vibrant. Conversely, when a culture is prevented interaction with other cultures, as is the case in repressive regime, not only is cultural development stunted, but people's safety is undermined and people's well-being is diminished. So the idea that the human rights of women and the right to culture are uniquely irreconcilable relies on false, essentialist assumptions about culture. As just noted, protecting culture against presumed foreign elements is not only impossible because cultures constantly mix and evolve in response to each other. It is also dangerous, particularly for the least powerful. The second argument against the presumed opposition between women's human rights and cultural rights is that taking at face values the presumed opposition between women's human rights and cultural rights overlooks the power differences and the power dynamics at the disadvantage of women that make it difficult for women to participate in definition of their own culture. Since all current societies are patriarchal, men's political and material interests and cultural values are more visible than women's in communities and cultures. Men also tend to use their power to safeguard and advance cultural beliefs and practices that represent their interests and values. Most harmful to women is when men define their interests and values as culturally neutral, as natural order, and or as divinely ordained. In recognition of these power dynamics at the disadvantage of women, when women's human rights are challenged on the basis of cultural rights, it is critical to ask who speaks for that culture, whose interests and values are presented as the interests and values of that culture, who benefits and who is harmed from culturalizing rights. The answer to these questions is is that it is overwhelmingly men who have the status and power to define and speak for their culture. And it is overwhelmingly male values and interests that are advanced as culture. This means that men's and women's equality in human rights is in contradiction, not with the right to culture, but with patriarchal interpretation of culture and with patriarchal interests and values. In other words, overlooking the fact that men disproportionately speak for culture elevates men's interpretation of culture to generic and representative and hides the forced silence of women in their culture. Disregarding men's disproportionate influence on culture not only compromises women's rights to define culture, it also interferes with men's right to have women's input in culture. A third argument against the idea of an opposition between women's human rights and the right to culture is that this opposition relies on a selective use of cultural relativism that is selective to women and against women's human rights only. The universality of human rights is often not questioned when the human rights of men or the right to culture itself are at stake. Right to culture objections are often not raised when the individual human rights of boys and men are also involved. For example, in the case of the rights of children, of migrant workers, of ethnic minorities. This is Mona El-Tahawy, an Egyptian human rights activist. In reference to the oppression of girls and women in the Arab world, which is the focus of her book, Headscarves and Hymens, and of many of her speeches, she stated, cultural relativism is as much my enemy as the oppression I fight within my culture and faith. In her writing and speeches, she talks about the ubiquity in Muslim majority countries of sexual harassment in the street, which she leaves the public square as a solely male prerogative. She denounces the Muslim majority countries that support veiling, polygamy, the criminalization of sex between consenting adults, child marriage, which she decries as pedophilia. She also denounces Saudi Arabia's laws and practices as gender apartheid. Specifically in relation to the idea of cultural relativism, she criticizes so-called Westerners who let their cultural relativism, their so-called respect for other cultures, trump their defense of basic human rights. Her words again are, cultural relativism is as much my enemy as the oppression I fight within my culture and faith. El-Tahawy and other several human rights scholars and activists have also argued that condoning on the part of Western liberals, so to speak, violation of the rights of women in cultures other than one's own for fear of imposing cultural values represents cultural contempt, not cultural respect. A culturalized justice paradigm may also betray a racist perception of the inevitability of violent behavior on the part of foreign cultural perpetrators, they stated. Whatever the intention, a culturalized justice approach abandons the vulnerable, they wrote. El-Tahawy has called the non-Muslim women to support or fight against the oppression of Muslim women in Muslim majority societies. Unquote, this is different than calling on anyone to rescue us, she affirmed. Similarly, Australian scholar Winter wrote that the defense of harmful practices, unquote, is a form of cross-cultural collusion among men. Not only because men's role in perpetuating such practices and the ways in which they benefit from them are not clearly identified, but also because there appears to be a tacit agreement that the rights of women are indeed a family affair. Winter also wrote that from the perspective of those who want to subordinate women human rights to the right of culture, unquote, UN treaties in favor of religious and cultural rights do not appear to be as problematically Western as those which defend human rights of women. It is particularly telling and worrying how women's rights are manipulated in the name of group cultural rights. Another part of this third argument, which is about selective use of cultural relativism, is that charges of imperialism are also selectively used in the case of women's human rights and against women's human rights only. Imperialism objections are not typically raised when the individual human rights of men are at stake. Imperialism objections are mostly made when the human rights of women are concerned. Taken together, the evidence and argumentation are reviewed in this presentation support, in my view, the conclusion that the human rights of women and the right to culture are not in unique conflict. If anything, the opposition between the human rights of women and the right to culture is one of the many cases of tension between the principle of the universality of human rights and the principle of the right to culture. A tension which, according to majority opinion in human rights discourse, requires steadfast attention to prevent the use of culture to justify discrimination. The presumption of a unique opposition between the human rights of women and the rights to culture simply represents and sustains the interests of patriarchy. It also undermines the very foundation of the human rights movement. It is an idea that is dangerous for the majority of humanity, particularly the least powerful in their society, and for all who depend for their basic needs on a vigorous human rights agenda and human rights surveillance globally. What is unique about the tension between the human rights of women and the rights to culture is the pervasiveness of patriarchal systems, and therefore the broad impact that the implementation of the equality of women and men in human rights has for all societies. As noted by Ertürk, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, unquote, negotiating culture with human rights concerns inherently questions, delegitimizes, destabilizes, ruptures, and in the long run destroys oppressive hierarchies. The challenge, she says, is to resist oppressive practices disguised under the cloak of culture. In this sense, the unique resistance to the equality in human rights of women and men is understandable. The extent of this resistance is in many ways a measure of how entrenched and how pervasive patriarchy is. Therefore, the idea of a unique opposition between the human rights of women and the right to culture needs to be vigorously challenged in theory and in practice, including by psychologists and in psychology, where it can also have pernicious consequences. A good portion of what I cover in this presentation comes from these two chapters. Other important references are cited in these two chapters. This concludes the presentation part of the webinar. Thank you for your attention to the presentations. We now shall move to the question and answer part of the webinar.
Thank you, Silvia. Grazie for the presentation and for your talk. We already have a couple of questions for you. So, oh, yeah, they're coming. Let me read it for you, or you can open it as well in the Q&A. Maybe it's easier to follow. I have heard the argument in regards to women engaging in safety behaviors, such as carrying pepper spray, to avoid being sexually harassed or raped, that women are making a choice to engage in safety behaviors and are being hyper-vigilant. How the speakers respond using the systemic feminist psychology and women's human rights lenses. Thank you for an excellent presentation, says Anne Driscoll. Can you, Sylvia, share your opinion to this?
If I understand the question, it is about agency and women taking agency in their own protection. And yes, that is very important. I would also want to make the point that women's safety is men's business and responsibility, that we shouldn't frame issues of violence by men against women as women's problem. It's men's problem, and it's men's responsibility to change.
Thank you, Sylvia. There is another question from a psychotherapist who asks how to handle and get case history of sexual harassment, what kind of human rights need to follow and therapy should follow.
Sorry, say it again. In therapy, what should be done in terms of
getting the case history when a sexual harassment occurred, and how to take into consideration human rights in such a case?
As we articulated in this presentation, as well as in the presentation that was given in the first webinar, I think the common thread is that human rights perspectives really bolster, strengthen the actions of psychology towards the protection of all kinds of rights of their clients and of their participants in research and other students, but elevates in many ways the discourse beyond the guidelines of ethics that are given by individual professional association like the American Psychological Association in the case of the United States, really to make it a much stronger and global kind of set of responsibilities that are in many ways also driven by the fact that many of the countries in which we live signed this human rights convention, and at least in theory, bound all of us to be responsive to them in whatever location we may find ourselves, professionally or not.
Thank you. There is the question contains the question about the specific therapy, if you are familiar, or if you can give any specific advice about psychotherapy that should be employed in such cases.
What therapy?
What kind of psychotherapy? The question is repeated also in the chat, in cases of sexual harassment and human rights violations in that regard. Do you think if there is any specific psychotherapeutical approach?
In many ways, I would say that we need to act on many fronts. We certainly need to respond to the individual situation and understand it in context and through the lenses of intersectionality. At the same time, I think that as psychologists, and in many ways, that I see as one of the new kind of lessons or that we are trying to bring through the series, is to really think at the population level, at the broad level, at the community level, so that we think of prevention that will lead to fewer individual cases of abuse and violence and discrimination. So I think those are two kinds of tactics, and in many ways, two kinds of trainings. Psychologists tended to focus a lot more on training, on intervening at the individual level. And I would say that as psychologists, we need to think about expanding formally the training and the responsibilities that we have also in research and as well as in advocacy to these higher population levels.
Yes, I would agree with that. The question follows our colleague or student would like to have a specific answer whether cognitive behavior therapy or neurolinguistic programming would be the best suitable therapy for that. But I just agree with you. It has to be person-oriented and have this contextual frame, and it doesn't actually matter that a specific therapeutical approach is best for such a thing. There is a question that relates with the slogan of this year's International Women's Day, which is Break the Bias. So Serena Meilani says, hello doctors, happy International Women's Day. A lovely and insightful presentation from both of you. As a young Asian woman, I have been struggling hard to fight against these gender, probably inequalities, that is imbued in my culture since I was a baby. As a merely teenager in my young age, what or how do I start to fight against these boundaries in my culture?
I kind of, in many ways, wish to refrain to provide individual advice to people, especially in cultures other than the one I know more intimately well. I'd rather stay at the level of principles and ideas, and in many ways congruent with this idea that when we understand ourselves and others, we need to do it through the lenses of culture and the lenses of human rights. But that the application and the interpretation locally, again, need to be in many ways very much driven in consultation and with the leadership of people locally. So I would say that the broad instruments are there for you to consider in terms of the human rights principle and declaration, and then what it means locally and personally. I think that would probably be something that requires your initiative and leadership. And on the prior question, again, I think in terms of the psychotherapy, I would like to say that any psychotherapy to be good, I would say, it requires attention to context. So no matter what the approach, we need to understand the individual in context.
Could I follow up with that for just 1 second? Sylvia, we have many participants in ICP who join these webinars, and a very common question is, what can I do? Right, like what can we take action on right now? And I appreciate you're speaking to people from literally all over the world with different cultures and different situations. It's International Women's Day. Can you give us any guidance with respect to people who want to get up and do something today?
In many ways, I would like to repeat my answer, both reach out locally and see what's happening and contribute to what's happening in your place, and look at what the priorities are, because the priority may be different in different orders and in different place, as well as connect globally, because sometimes the local perspective can be great and important, but there may be also things that we can't see because we are so ourselves embedded in our culture that we can't imagine to challenge certain things because we have habituated to them, or we've internalized them and they've become part of us, and they've become the instrument of our own oppression, but we don't notice it. And sometimes it takes someone else to say, by the way, do you notice that you are repeating in some ways certain practices that are undermining of yourself, while you're in many ways noting violation of human rights in other places, or in other places, literally locally or globally. So I think it's that local and global dynamic that I think, as well as your preferences. I mean, each one of us has interest and expertise that drive us in one direction or another. So we can't do everything. And therefore we want to seek the places of intervention in terms of human rights of women that most fit our time and place and energy.
Very good, thank you, good.
Thank you, Sylvia. I just wanted to say something related to what you answered. We in the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights have issued the March issue of our monthly bulletin, and we dedicated it to, in honor to International Women's Day. And we presented there 4 stories or interviews with our colleagues, our female colleagues, who face, some of them face human rights violations in their countries while they were growing up, or in their work as well. And I see that 2 of them are here now today. I will just tell you who they are, and what we wanted to do with this is to share stories of women who do something, who connect psychology and human rights. And for some of you, this may be inspirational. You may contact them, and you may make a network, and you may seek support, just like you asked Sylvia right now. So Aimee Karam is from Lebanon, and she wrote a story, One Entity, Many Facets, related to the slogan, Break the Bias. Then Saima Ayman, who is also here today from Pakistan, wrote the story of her work and how she connects human rights and psychology, and also how she connects it with her both working life and private life. Then we have a story by Maria Sabunava from St. Petersburg, Russia, about being cyber violated because of advocating for the rights of LGBT people. And we have a story by our colleague Katerina Pascu from Greece, who writes about a project with refugee women that she works with. And she provides actually some tools how to work with people, with women coming from different countries to some new countries, and how to tackle very sensitive issues of sexual harassment. So this is something that may give you some inspiration and maybe possibilities to connect.
Thank you, Marlene.
Are there any questions? I think we have reached actually our planned limit. Thank you very much for the questions, for the comments. Thank you, Sylvia, once again. And thank you, Sean, Mary, for being in our background, our very important technical support, and not only technical. And Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlena. And also, again, special thanks to both Sean and Sylvia for a wonderfully informative presentation. And of course, to Mary Bullock, who's behind the scenes making all of this happen for us. Thank you, Mary. Please note that if you would like a certificate of attendance, that it is necessary that you let us know if you're not working from your own computer and where we should send the certificate to, the email address in receipt. Please also note that the next in our series of collaborative webinars between ICP and the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights will be held May 16th. That's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Central European Time. Ulrich Wagner will be presenting to us, and we will hope that you can join us then. Everyone, thank you for your time today. Have a good day. Bye-bye.